Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library, and I'm so glad that you could join me today for our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Today we'll be reading chapters 37 and 38. I think these are a little bit longer chapters, so we may go the full hour this time. I guess we'll find out. Just to recap briefly, our three uh, captives slash guests on board the Nautilus, Professor Pierre Aronnax, marine biology professor, and his faithful manservant Conseil, and the Canadian harpooner Ned Land are all prisoners aboard the Nautilus, captained by Captain Nemo. And he is basically taking them around the world on a kind of a nice gesture, I guess, on his part, that he wants to kind of show off everything that he has learned and seen while under the ocean. He has a brand new audience now. He's kind of seems to be playing to that a little bit, and they've seen the sunken city of Atlantis, and they've seen underwater volcanoes, and they've seen sunken ships, and a host of marine life with very complicated Latin names, and a bunch of other stuff as well. In our last chapter, they had come across a pod of black whales, and there were some, and Captain Nemo kind of waxes poetic about these wonderful black whales and how what good animals they are and how they should really be preserved if at all possible. But then, of course, at the very next thing that happens is a herd of sperm whales come along and start to attack the black whales. And then, while Ned Land was perfectly willing to get a harpoon and start harpooning some of those sperm whales, the Captain Nemo kind of says, "You know what? I'll take care of this." Almost kind of snubbing Ned Land's expertise in this. And he uses the pointed prow of the Nautilus submarine as a weapon and basically sails, drives, navigates the Nautilus into this a pod of sperm whales, killing most, if not all of them, and thereby trying to save the black whale. So it's kind of an odd thing that doesn't really fit with our modern sensibilities, because here you are saying that this one whale is really, really great, and then in order to save them, you are killing a whole lot more of these other whales. And yet, for some reason, how can you place this? Um, how can you place such this evil intent on the sperm whales, since they're kind of just doing their thing, just like the black whales are? Again, it doesn't really fit quite well with the way we think nowadays, but this was the 1860s, and so we are 1880s, and so we are sort of seeing this from their viewpoint. And I also find it interesting, and this is just a little side note, that I've noticed that every major animal kind of interaction seems to focus on whether people can eat them or not, which is another kind of odd thing to hear. It's like, here's whale meat. Oh, can you eat it? And here's they killed a dugong, or they hunted a dugong in um, either the Red Sea or the Indian Sea. I can't remember now. And that was again something else that they had used as a meal. And so every animal, while we look at it nowadays as more of an aesthetic, that this is something that belongs in nature, and that nature should be kind of somewhat preserved and make sure that these animals do not go extinct. There was also a lot of things relating to, hey, that's a really great animal. Can you eat it? So interesting viewpoint, interesting kind of a different focus there. We're going to see a little bit more of that in our next chapter, which is chapter 37, entitled The Great Ice Barrier. So if you are ready, The Nautilus once again took up its steady southern course. It followed the 50th meridian, traveling at a considerable speed. Did the captain want to try to reach the South Pole? I did not think so, for till then every attempt to reach it had failed. Moreover, it was already nearly too late in the season, for the 13th of March in the Antarctic corresponds to the 13th of September in northern regions. On the 14th of March, I saw floating ice near the 55 degrees south latitude, but it was no more than bits or pieces of 20 to 25 feet long, forming reefs against which the sea broke into foam. The Nautilus stayed on the surface. To Ned Land, who had already fished in Arctic waters, icebergs were a familiar sight, but Conseil and I were admiring them for the first time. Toward the southern horizon there was a shining white streak in the sky. English whalers have named it ice blink. No matter how many clouds there are, it is never hidden from view. It announces the presence of a pack or bank of ice. And, in fact, we soon began to see real icebergs shining with a brilliance which varied according to the changing mist. Some of them contained green veins, as if streaked with wavy lines of copper sulfate. Others seemed like enormous transparent amethysts, reflecting the sunlight in 1,000 facets of their crystals. Others, tinted by the limestone they contained, would have supplied enough marble to construct a city. The farther south we went, the more numerous and large these icebergs became. Polar birds were nesting on them by the thousands. There were petrels and puffins deafening us with their cries. Some of them, mistaking the Nautilus for the body of a dead whale, would alight on its deck and try pecking at its steel plates. While we were navigating among these icebergs, Captain Nemo remained on deck a good deal of the time. He was carefully observing these deserted waters. Every now and then I would see his calm eyes light up. Was he saying to himself that since the Antarctic Sea was closed off to other men, he was at home and master of these impassable spaces? Perhaps, but he said nothing. He remained immobile, only coming out of his reverie when his helmsman's instincts finally got the upper hand. He then took the wheel and guided the ship with consummate skill, cleverly avoiding collisions with these masses of ice, some of which were several miles long and 200 to 250 feet high. Often the horizon seemed completely blocked. Then, finally, when we had reached 60 degrees south latitude, every passageway had disappeared. But after a careful search, Captain Nemo soon bravely maneuvered the ship into a narrow opening, knowing only too well that it would close in behind him. Thus the Nautilus, guided by his skillful hand, passed through all that ice which, to Conseil's delight, has been classified with great precision according to its shape and size. There are icebergs which are shaped like mountains, ice fields stretching out in vast unbroken plains, drift ice or floating ice, and ice packs called pouches when they are round, and streams when they are arranged in elongated strips. The temperature was quite low. The outside thermometer registered between 27 and 28 degrees. But we were warmly dressed in clothes made of seal or polar bear fur. The inside of the Nautilus was heated by its electrical apparatus and could maintain an even temperature against the severest cold. Moreover, we merely had to dive several fathoms down to find a more comfortable temperature. 2 months earlier in these latitudes, we would have had a period of perpetual daylight, but now there were already 3 or 4 hours of night, and later on 6 months of darkness would descend on these regions around the pole. But March 15th, we had passed the latitude of the South Shetland and South Orkney Islands. The captain told me that large herds of seals used to inhabit these islands, but that English and American whalers, in their rage for destruction, had massacred the adult males and pregnant females and left behind them the silence of death. Toward 8 in the morning of March 16th, the Nautilus, cruising along the 55th meridian, crossed the Antarctic Circle. We were so surrounded by ice that the horizon was hidden from view. Nevertheless, Captain Nemo went from one passageway to the next, always heading south. "Where do you suppose we're going?" I asked. "Straight ahead," replied Conseil. "After all, he can't go any further. He'll stop." "I wouldn't swear to that," I answered. And, to be frank, I did not dislike the idea of this new adventure on which we had embarked. I cannot describe the beauties of this new region. The ice took on extraordinary shapes. Here it would look like an oriental town with its innumerable minarets and mosques. There, like a ruined city, destroyed by some earthquake. The scenery was constantly varied by the sun's oblique rays, or lost in gray mists or blizzards. From all sides came the sound of icebergs cracking apart, crumbling, or falling over. If the Nautilus happened to be cruising underwater when these things took place, the sound would travel through the ocean with incredible intensity, and these masses of falling ice would create a backwash which could be felt to the deepest parts of the ocean. The Nautilus would then roll and pitch like a ship at the mercy of the elements. Often I could see no way out and thought we would be imprisoned forever. But guided by his instinct, Captain Nemo would find tiny openings and lead us into new passageways. He never erred in picking out the tiny threads of bluish water running through the ice fields. I therefore felt sure he had already sailed the Nautilus through Antarctic waters. Nevertheless, on March 16th, our path was finally completely blocked by ice. We had not yet reached the Great Ice Barrier, but we were among vast ice fields cemented together by the cold. This obstacle, however, did not stop Captain Nemo, and he sent the Nautilus hurtling against the ice with incredible violence. The submarine entered this brittle mass like a wedge and split it open with terrible cracking sounds. It was like a battering ram with infinite power behind it. Pieces of ice were thrown high in the air and then fell around us like hail. Our ship carved out a path for itself by brute force. Occasionally, its momentum would be such that it would rise up on top of the ice field and then crush it beneath its weight. Or sometimes, when it became embedded within the ice field, it would split it open by pitching back and forth. During this time, we were assaulted by violent squalls. Then there would be fogs so thick we could not see from one end of the platform to the other. Sudden winds would spring up from any point of the compass. Snow would pile up so deep and compact on the ship that it would have to be chipped off with pickaxes. The temperature would only have to go down to 23 degrees for the whole outside of the Nautilus to become covered with ice. Rigging would have been unusable, for all the tackle that would have become frozen. Only a ship without sails and propelled by electricity could venture into these latitudes. During this whole period, the barometer remained very low. Moreover, the compass no longer gave reliable readings. Its needle would madly point in all directions as we got nearer to the South Magnetic Pole, which must not be confused with the South Pole itself. In fact, according to Hanston, the magnetic pole is situated at about 70 degrees south latitude and 130 degrees longitude, and according to Duperrey's observations at 135 degrees longitude and 70 degrees 30 minutes south latitude. We therefore had to take numerous readings on compasses placed in different parts of the ship and then take a mean. But often we could only chart our route by guesswork, a highly unsatisfactory method in the midst of these winding passageways among continually shifting landmarks. Finally, on March 18th, after 20 useless assaults, the Nautilus found itself completely blocked. This was no longer an ice stream, pouch, or ice field, but an interminable, immobile chain of mountains welded together. "The Great Ice Barrier," said the Canadian. I realized that for Ned Land, as well as for all the other sailors who had preceded us, this was the impassable obstacle. Toward noon, the sun appeared for a moment, and permitted Captain Nemo to obtain a fairly exact reading for our position, 51 degrees 30 minutes west longitude and 67 degrees 39 minutes south latitude. We were already far into Antarctic regions. Before we could no longer see any water, before us, we could no longer see any water. Beyond the Nautilus's prow stretched a vast plain, twisted and tangled in a confused mass of ice. It had the capricious helter-skelter look of the surface of a river just before the ice breaks up, but on a gigantic scale. Here and there were sharp peaks rising like thin needles 200 feet into the air. Farther on, a row of sheer grayish cliffs reflected the sun's rays like huge mirrors lost in the mist. And over this desolate expanse reigned a grim silence, only occasionally broken by the wing beat of petrels or puffins. Everything, even sound, was frozen. Here the Nautilus was forced to halt in its daring journey through the ice fields. "Monsieur," said Ned Land, "if that captain of yours goes any further—" "What then, Ned?" "Why, then he's a Superman." "Why, Ned?" "Because no one can cross the great ice barrier. Captain Nemo may be quite a man, but he can't overcome nature. And where nature tells you to stop, you have to stop whether you like it or not." "You're right, Ned, but all the same, I'd like to know what's behind this barrier. Nothing infuriates me more than a wall." "Monsieur's right," said Conseil. "Walls are invented to frustrate scientists. There shouldn't be walls anywhere." "Well, that's all very fine," said the Canadian, "but anyone can tell you that what you'll find behind this barrier." "What?" I asked. "Ice, and more ice." "I'm not so sure about that, Ned. That's why I would like to go farther." Give up that idea, Professor," replied the Canadian. "You've gotten as far as the Great Ice Barrier. That should be enough. Even with Captain Nemo and his Nautilus, you won't get any further. And whether he wants to or not, he'll have to head back north where normal people live." I must admit that Ned Land was right, and until they make ships that can sail over ice fields, they will have to stop before the Great Ice Barrier. And true enough, in spite of its efforts and its powerful means of splitting ice, the Nautilus became completely hemmed in. Ordinarily, if one does not want to go any further, one can merely turn back. But here, turning back was as impossible as going forward, for all passages had closed in behind us. Although we were now merely hemmed in, the submarine would soon become embedded in the ice. And this is what began happening toward 2 in the afternoon, when new ice formed along the sides of the ship with astonishing speed. I had to admit that Captain Nemo's conduct had been exceedingly rash. I was then on the platform. The captain, who had been watching the situation for several minutes, said to me, "Well, Professor, what do you think of our situation?" I think we're trapped, Captain. Trapped? What do you mean? I mean that we can't go forward, backward, or sideways. I think that's what's meant by trapped in the inhabited parts of the Earth. So, Monsieur Aronnax, you think the Nautilus won't be able to get free? It will be very difficult, Captain, for it's already too late in the year to be able to count on the ice breaking up. Oh, Professor, replied Captain Nemo in an ironic tone of voice. You'll always be the same. You never see anything but difficulties and obstacles. But let me say that not only will the Nautilus free herself, but she will take us even farther. Farther south? I asked, looking at the captain. Yes, monsieur. To the South Pole. To the South Pole, I cried, unable to repress a gesture of disbelief. Yes, the captain answered, coldly. To the South Pole, that unknown point where all the meridians of the globe meet. As you know, I can make the Nautilus do what I want. Yes, that much I knew. I also knew that this man was brave to the point of being foolhardy. But the South Pole? It was surrounded by many more obstacles than the North Pole, which even the bravest navigators have not yet reached. To go there would be absolutely mad. It was an idea that could only arise in the mind of a crazy man. I then got the idea of asking the captain if he had already discovered the South Pole. No, monsieur, he answered. But we will discover it together. Where others have failed, I shall succeed. I have never taken my Nautilus this far south, but I repeat, she will go yet farther. I would like to believe you, Captain, I said in a somewhat ironic tone of voice. In fact, it ought to be easy. No obstacles too great for us. We'll just smash the barrier. We'll blow it up. And if it can't be blown up, we'll put wings on the Nautilus and fly over it. Over it, Professor? Captain Nemo replied calmly. No, not over it, but under it. Under it, I cried. Suddenly I realized what the captain had in mind. I understood what he was going to do. The Nautilus's marvelous powers were once again going to be employed in a superhuman undertaking. I think we're beginning to understand one another, Professor, said the captain, half smiling. You're beginning to see the possibility, or the success, as I prefer to think of it, of this attempt. Things you cannot do with an ordinary ship become easy with the Nautilus. If there is a continent at the pole, we will be forced to stop before this continent. But if on the contrary there's open ocean there, we will sail to the very pole. That's right, I said, carried away by the captain's reasoning. For although the surface of the sea is frozen, the water deeper down must be free, for the heaven-sent reason that the maximum density of water occurs at 2 degrees above freezing point. And unless I'm mistaken, the submerged portion of this barrier is in a ratio of 4:1 to the part above water. Very nearly, Professor. For every foot of an iceberg that is above water, there are 3 feet below. Now, since none of these mountains of ice are higher than 300 feet, they won't go any deeper than 900 feet into the water. And what is 900 feet for the Nautilus? Nothing, Captain. It could even go deeper to find that area of temperature common to all oceans. And there we would be completely impervious to the 30 or 40 degrees below zero on the surface. Absolutely, Captain, I said, becoming more animated. The only difficulty, Captain Nemo continued, will be to remain submerged for several days without renewing our air supply. Is that the only difficulty? I retorted. The Nautilus has vast reservoirs which can be filled and thereby furnish us with all the oxygen we'll need. Well thought out, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the captain with a smile. But since I don't want you to accuse me of being rash, I am reminding you in advance of all my objections. Are there any others? Only one. If there is water at the South Pole, it's possible that it will be entirely frozen over, and that we would therefore be unable to surface. But, Captain, you're forgetting that the Nautilus is armed with a powerful spur. Why couldn't we come up under these ice fields from below and break them open? Aha, Professor, you're full of ideas today. Moreover, Captain, I added, working up to a pitch of enthusiasm, why shouldn't there be open water at the South Pole just as there is at the North Pole? The poles of cold and those of Earth are not the same either in the Arctic or the Antarctic, and until we have proof to the contrary, we must suppose that at these 2 points there is either land or open ocean. I think so too, Monsieur Aronnax, replied Captain Nemo. Let me merely remark that after raising so many objections to my plan, you are now flooding me with arguments in its favor. This was true. I was getting bolder than he. I was the one persuading him to go to the pole. I was the leader, the man willing to... No, stop your daydreaming, you poor fool. Captain Nemo knew better than you the pros and cons of the question. He was just playing a game with you, watching you being carried away with visions of the impossible. Meanwhile, he did not lose a moment. He signaled, and the first mate appeared. The two of them spoke rapidly in their incomprehensible language, and either because the first mate had been warned beforehand or because he considered the project reasonable, he showed no surprise. But as impassive as he may have been, he could not compare with Conseil when I told him of our intent to push on to the South Pole. As an answer, I received a mere, "As monsieur wishes," and had to be content with that. As for Ned Land, he gave the largest shrug I've ever seen. "Believe me, monsieur," he said, "I feel sorry for you and your Captain Nemo." "But we'll reach the South Pole, Ned." "Maybe, but you won't come back." And then Ned Land went back to his cabin so he wouldn't, quote, "do something desperate," unquote, as he said upon leaving. Meanwhile, the ship was made ready for this bold attempt. The Nautilus's powerful pumps brought air into the reservoirs and stored it there under high pressure. Toward 4 o'clock, Captain Nemo announced that the hatches leading to the platform would be closed. I took one last look at the thick barrier we were about to cross. The sky was clear, the air pure and cold. It was 10 degrees above zero. But now that the wind had died down, this temperature did not seem too unbearable. 10 or so men got onto the sides of the Nautilus and broke the ice around the hull with pickaxes. Soon we were free. It took little time, for the new ice was still thin. We all went back inside. The reservoirs were filled with the water that had not frozen around the hull, and the Nautilus started down. I and Conseil had taken up our posts in the lounge. Through the open panels we looked out into the waters of this southern sea. The thermometer rose. The needle on the pressure gauge started moving down. As Captain Nemo had predicted, at about 900 feet we found ourselves floating beneath the undulating surface of the barrier. but the Nautilus went yet farther down. We finally stopped at a depth of 2,600 feet. The temperature of the water had risen 2 degrees, from 10 degrees at the surface to 12 degrees at this depth. It goes without saying that the temperature inside the Nautilus, maintained by its heating devices, was much higher than this. Every operation was carried out with extraordinary precision. "If monsieur will permit me to say so, I think we will pass the ice barrier," said Conseil. "I'm sure we will," I answered with deep conviction. Now that it was in open water, the Nautilus headed straight for the South Pole, cruising along the 52nd meridian. We had to go from 67 degrees 30 minutes to 90 degrees 22.5 degrees of latitude, or more than 1,000 miles. The Nautilus was traveling at an average of 26 knots, the speed of an express train. If it kept going at this rate, we would be there in 40 hours. The novelty of our situation kept Conseil and me at the glass panels of the lounge for a good part of the night. The sea was lit up by the electric light, but it was empty. No fish lived in these imprisoned waters. For them, it was only a way of getting from the Antarctic Ocean to the open water around the pole. We were traveling fast, and the long steel hull trembled as it sped through the water. Toward 2 in the morning, I went to get several hours of sleep. Conseil did the same. As I went down the gangway, I did not meet Captain Nemo. I supposed he was at the helm. At 5 on the following morning, I went back to my post in the lounge. The electric log showed that we had reduced our speed. The Nautilus was cautiously returning toward the surface, emptying its reservoirs slowly. My heart was beating fast. Were we going to come up and find ourselves in open water near the South Pole? No. A sudden thud told me that the Nautilus had struck the underside of the ice barrier, which was still very thick, judging by the dead sound of the blow. We had, in fact, touched the ground, to use a nautical term, but upside down and at a depth of 1,000 feet. This meant that there were 1,333 feet of ice above us, 333 feet of which were above water. The barrier was slightly higher here than it was at the edge, not a very comforting thought. The Nautilus tried the same experiment several times that day, and every time it was stopped short by the wall overhead. In certain places, it met ice at a depth of 3,000 feet, which meant that the ice was 4,000 feet thick, with 1,000 feet protruding above the surface. This was 3 times the height of the barrier at the point where the Nautilus had first gone under. I carefully noted these various depths, and I was thus able to obtain an underwater outline of this icy mountain chain. That evening our situation remained unchanged. We continued to find ice at depths varying from 1,300 to 1,600 feet. This was an improvement, but there was still quite a distance between us and the surface of the ocean. It was then 8 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, the air should have been renewed in the Nautilus according to the usual custom on board, but I was not feeling the lack of it too much. Even though Captain Nemo had not started using his reserve supply, I slept fitfully that night. I was assailed by hopes and fears. I got up several times. The Nautilus continued trying to break through. Toward 3 in the morning, I noticed that we met the underside of the barrier at a depth of only 150 feet. The barrier was little by little turning back into an ice field. The mountains were changing into plains. My eyes remained fixed on the pressure gauge. We kept climbing, following the underside of the ice, which sparkled beneath the rays of the electric light. Slowly but surely, the barrier was getting thinner. Finally, at 6 in the morning on that memorable day of March 19th, the door of the lounge opened. Captain Nemo entered and said, "Open water!" Chapter 38, The South Pole. I rushed out on the platform. Yes, we were in open water. There were only a few icebergs scattered here and there. A broad sea stretched out into the distance. The sky was full of birds, and myriads of fish swam in water, ranging in color from a deep blue to olive green. The thermometer read 37 degrees. Relatively speaking, it was like spring here behind the great ice barrier, whose far-off masses were outlined against the northern horizon. "Are we at the South Pole?" I asked the captain, with my heart throbbing. "I don't know," he said. "At noon we'll take our position." "But will we be able to see the sun through these clouds?" I asked, looking up at the gray sky. "We will only need to get a faint glimpse of it to be able to take our position," the captain replied. 10 miles to the south, a solitary island rose about 700 feet above us. Above the surface. We headed for it cautiously, for these waters could have been strewn with reefs. An hour later, we had reached it, and in 2 more hours, we had gone all the way around it. It was 4 or 5 miles in circumference. A narrow channel separated it from a considerable body of land, perhaps an entire continent, whose limits we could not see. The existence of this land seemed to prove Maury right. This clever American scientist has stated, in fact, that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel, the sea is covered with enormous icebergs, much bigger than those found in the North Atlantic. From this, he deduced that within the Antarctic Circle there lies a considerable body of land. Since icebergs cannot form over water, but only at coastlines, according to his calculations, the mass of ice surrounding the South Pole forms a cap about 2,500 miles wide. The Nautilus had stopped out of fear of running aground, about 600 yards from a beach above, which rose a superb mass of rocks. The dinghy was put to sea, and the captain, 2 of his men carrying instruments, Conseil, and myself got in. It was 10 in the morning. I had not seen Ned Land. He undoubtedly did not relish the idea of having to swallow his words in the presence of the South Pole. Several strokes of the oars brought the dinghy to the sandy shore, where it was beached. Conseil was about to jump out, but I held him back. "Monsieur," I said to Captain Nemo, "it is your privilege to be the first to set foot on this land." "Yes, monsieur," answered the captain. "And if I don't hesitate to go ashore to the South Pole, it is because till now no human being has ever been here." With this, he jumped out lightly onto the sand. His heart beat with emotion. He climbed up to an overhanging rock on a little promontory, and there, with his arms crossed, eyes burning, immobile and silent, he seemed to take possession of these Antarctic regions. After spending 5 minutes in this state of ecstasy, he turned toward us and said, "Whenever you wish, monsieur." Conseil and I got out, leaving the 2 men in the dinghy. Over a considerable area, the terrain consisted of reddish volcanic rock, looking as if it had been made of ground bricks. It was covered with bits of slag, hardened lava, and pumice stone. There was no doubt about its volcanic origin. In certain places, little smoke holes gave out a sulphurous odor, and bore witness to the fact that the fires inside the earth still retained their force. However, upon climbing a steep slope, I saw no volcanoes within a radius of several miles. It is well known, however, that in the Antarctic, James Ross discovered the two craters called Erebus and Terror in full activity at 167 degrees west longitude and 77 degrees 32 minutes south latitude. The vegetation of this desolate continent seemed very limited. Some lichens of the species Untitled Chapter were spread out on the black rocks. These, along with certain microscopic plants, such as diatoms, with their single cells placed between two quartz shells, and long purple and crimson sea wrack thrown up on the shore by the surf, were the only signs of plant life in this region. The coast was sprinkled with shellfish, little mussels, limpets, smooth heart-shaped cockles, and especially cleones with their oblong membranous bodies and their head made of two round lobes. We also saw many of those inch-long Arctic cleones, which a whale swallowed by the thousands in one mouthful. The water near the shore was alive with these charming pteropods, veritable butterflies of the sea. Among other zoophytes in the shallows, I noticed some tree-shaped corals of a type which, according to James Ross, live in Antarctic waters down to the depths of 3,000 feet. I also saw little Alcyonaceae belonging to the species Procelaria pelagica, as well as a great number of starfish peculiar to the region. But it was in the air that life really abounded. Thousands of birds of all kinds soared and fluttered overhead, deafening us with their cries. Others were crowded together on rocks, watching us pass by so fearlessly that sometimes we had to step over them. There were auks, so agile and supple in the water that could be mistaken for bonitos, and yet so clumsy and heavy on land. They let out strange cries and assembled in large groups, moving little but making a great deal of noise. Among other birds, I noticed some chiones belonging to the wader family. They were about the size of pigeons, white in color with short conical beak and a red circle around their eyes. Conseil captured a few, for if well cooked, these birds can make a very good dish. Overhead passed sooty albatrosses with a wingspan of about 13 feet, justly called the vultures of the ocean, giant petrels, and, among others, a species called the sea eagle, which is a great killer of seals. A kind of small checkered duck, and many kinds of ordinary petrels, some whitish with brown borders on their wings, and another bluish species peculiar to Antarctic waters, which is so full of oil, as I told Conseil, that the inhabitants of the Faroe Islands merely stick a wick in them before lighting them. What a pity, said Conseil, that nature didn't build them with the wicks already in. That way they would have made the perfect lamps. Half a mile farther on, the ground was riddled with penguin nests. They were like burrows, arranged for laying eggs, and out of them would scramble innumerable birds braying like donkeys. Later on, Captain Nemo had several hundred penguins hunted and killed, for their black flesh is very good to eat. These creatures, with their slate-colored bodies, white bellies, and lemon-yellow bands around their necks, would allow themselves to be killed with stones without even trying to run away. Meanwhile, the sky was still gray, and at 11 o'clock the sun had not yet appeared. I was afraid It would not come out, and without the sun it was impossible to take our position. How then would we know if we had reached the South Pole? When I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him silently leaning on a rock and looking up at the sky. He seemed impatient and annoyed. What could he do? This brave, powerful man had no sway over the sun as he did over the sea. Noon came without the sun having appeared for a single moment. One could not even make out where it was behind the curtain of cloud. Then it began to snow. We will try again tomorrow. Excuse me. We will try again tomorrow, said the captain, and we went back to the Nautilus amid flurries of snow. During our absence, the nets had been put out, and I was interested to see what fish had been hauled on board. Antarctic waters served as a place of refuge for a great number of migratory fish who flee the storms of other regions, only to be eaten, it must be said, by porpoises and seals. I noticed several miller's thumbs, about 4 inches long, whitish, with pale stripes and armed with spines, and also some chimera, about 3 feet long, with slim bodies, silvery smooth skin, round heads, 3 fins on their back, and a snout shaped like a trunk curving in toward their mouth. I tasted them, but found them flavorless, whereas Conseil found they were much to his liking. The snowstorm lasted until the next day. It was impossible to stay on the platform. I stayed in the lounge, noting down the incidents of this polar excursion, and from there I could hear the cries of the petrels and albatrosses playing about in the midst of the storm. The Nautilus did not remain immobile. It traveled 10 or so miles farther south along the coast, cruising in a kind of half-light left by the sun as it touched the horizon. On the next day, March 20th, the snow had stopped, but it was a bit colder. The thermometer marked 28 degrees. The clouds were lifting, and I hoped that we would be able to take our position that day. Since Captain Nemo had not yet appeared, the dinghy took Conseil and me to shore. Here, too, the ground was volcanic. Everywhere there were traces of lava, slag, and basalt. But I was unable to find the crater which had emitted them. Here, as before, myriads of birds flew overhead, but now they had to share their dominion with the vast herds of marine mammals looking at us with their soft eyes. There were various kinds of seals, some stretched out on the ground, others lying on drift ice, and many going in or coming out of the sea. They had never seen men before, therefore did not run away as we drew near. I reckon there were enough of them here to stock several hundred ships. It is lucky, said Conseil, that Ned Land did not come along with us. Why, Conseil? Because the way he feels about hunting, he would have killed them all. Well, not all of them. That's a bit too much. But I doubt that we could have prevented our Canadian friend from harpooning several of these magnificent creatures. And this wouldn't have pleased Captain Nemo, who doesn't like to shed the blood of innocent animals without reason. He is right. He certainly is, Conseil. But tell me, haven't you yet classified these superb specimens of marine fauna? As monsieur knows, answered Conseil, I'm not very good at practical classification. If monsieur could tell me the names of these animals, well, they're seals and walruses. Both of these genera belong to the family of pinnipeds, Conseil hastened to say. Order of carnivores, division of ungulates, subclass of monodelphians, class of mammals, subkingdom of vertebrates. Very good, good, Conseil, I replied, but these two genera of seals and walruses are divided into various species. which, if I'm not mistaken, we'll be able to observe. Let's go. It was 8 in the morning, and we still had 4 hours until the sun would be usable for taking our position. I led the way to a vast bay cut into the granite cliffs along the shore. There, as far as the eye could see, the ground and floating ice was covered with these creatures, and I involuntarily looked for old Proteus, the mythological shepherd who watched over these immense flocks belonging to Neptune. Most of them were seals. They were in groups, with the males and females each carrying out their own tasks. The father watched over the family, and the mother suckled her young, while those little seals, already strong enough to walk, wandered off a short distance. When these creatures wanted to move, they did it in a series of little jumps made by contracting their bodies and helping themselves clumsily along with their flippers. But I must say that once they are in the water, their natural element, these animals, with their flexible spinal column, narrow pelvis, close cropped hair, and webbed feet, can swim marvelously. When they rest on land, they lie in graceful positions. Thus the ancients, noting their gentle faces, their expressive eyes, which are unsurpassed by those of most beautiful women, and their charming attitudes, poetically changed the males into tritons and the females into mermaids. I pointed out to Conseil the highly developed cerebral lobes of these intelligent creatures. No mammal except man has a greater brain capacity. Thus, seals are easily domesticated and capable of being trained to a certain extent, and I agree with certain naturalists who say that if properly taught, they could be used for fishing. Most of them were asleep on the rocks or on the sand. Among the seals, properly speaking, that is, those whose ears, unlike sea lions, do not protrude from their head, I saw several varieties of Sternorhynchiae, 10 feet long, with white hair, bulldog heads, and 10 teeth in each jaw, 4 incisors in the upper and 4 in the lower jaw, and 2 large canine teeth in each jaw shaped like lilies of the valley. Between them slithered some sea elephants, the kind of seal with a short, mobile trunk. They are the giants of the species, with bodies measuring 25 feet around and 33 feet in length. They did not move when we drew near. Aren't those animals dangerous? Conseil asked me. No, I answered, unless they're attacked. When a seal defends its young, its anger is terrible, and it isn't rare for them to break small fishing boats to pieces. They are only right to defend themselves. I can't deny that. 2 miles farther, we were stopped by a promontory which protected the bay from the south wind. It rose up vertically from the water, and the surf crashed against it. From beyond it, we could hear loud bellowings, as if from a herd of cattle. What's that? Asked Conseil. A chorus of bulls? No, I said, a chorus of walruses. Are they fighting? Either fighting or playing. With Monsieur's permission, I'd love to see them. Let's go, Conseil. And we started off, climbing over brackish rocks, among sudden landslides and stones covered with ice, and therefore very slippery. More than once I fell and hurt my back. Conseil, either because he was more careful or stronger, scarcely ever stumbled, and he could say, as he picked me up, if Monsieur would be kind enough to keep his feet apart, I think Monsieur would maintain his balance better. When we got to the ridge running along the top of the promontory, I saw a vast white plain covered with walruses. They were playing with one another. Their bellowings were of joy, not anger. Walruses resemble seals in the shape of their bodies and the disposition of their limbs, but they have no canine teeth or incisors in their lower jaw, whereas the canine teeth in their upper jaw form two tusks, 30 inches long and 13 inches around at the base. They are made of compact, unstreaked ivory, which is harder than that of elephants and does not turn yellow so quickly, and they are therefore much sought after. As a result, walruses have been hunted so indiscriminately that they will soon become extinct. For hunters kill about 4,000 a year, including pregnant females and the young. As I passed near these curious animals, I could examine them at my leisure, for they did not move. Their reddish tan skin was thick and rough. What hair they had was short. Some of them were 13 feet long. They seemed calmer and less fearful than their northern cousins, for they did not place sentinels around their camp. After examining this colony of walruses, I began to think of returning. It was 11 o'clock, and if Captain Nemo found the weather favorable for taking our position, I wanted to be present while he did it. Nevertheless, I had little hope that the sun would come out that day. It was hidden from our view. Ooh, bless me. These things just sneak up on you sometimes. Nevertheless, I had little hope that the sun would come out that day. It was hidden from our view by clouds squashed out along the horizon. It seemed as if the sun were jealous and did not want to reveal to human beings this unapproachable part of the globe. We started back toward the Nautilus, following a steep path running along the edge of the cliffs. By 11:30 we had reached our landing place. The dinghy had already returned with the captain. I saw him standing on a block of basalt. His instruments were next to him. His eyes were fixed on the northern horizon, near which the sun was describing its long arc. I went over and stood beside him without saying a word. Noon came, and, as on the day before, the sun did not appear. It was bad luck for us. We still had not been able to take our position. If it was not done the next day, we would have to give up our project completely. For it was the 20th of March. The next day, the 21st, would be the equinox. From then on, the sun would disappear behind the horizon for 6 months, and with its disappearance would begin the long polar night. Since the September equinox, it had emerged from the northern horizon and risen in long spirals until December 21st. On that day, the summer solstice of the southern hemisphere, it had started back down, and tomorrow it would send forth its last rays over the South Pole. I told Captain Nemo my thoughts and fears on this subject. "You are right, Monsieur Aronnax," he said. "If I cannot shoot the sun tomorrow, I will not be able to do so again for 6 months. But since fate has brought us here on precisely March 21st, our position will be easy to determine if the sun appears." "Why, Captain?" "Because when the sun is traveling through the sky in such elongated spirals, it is difficult to get an exact measurement of its height above the horizon, and one is in danger of making serious errors." "How will you do it, then?" "I will only use my chronometer," replied Captain Nemo. "If at noon tomorrow, March 21st, the sun's disk is cut exactly in two by the northern horizon, that will mean I'm at the South Pole." "Right," I said, "but this won't be, mathematically speaking, absolutely correct, for the equinox doesn't fall necessarily at noon." "No doubt, monsieur, but the error involved will be less than 100 yards, and that will be good enough for us. So, until tomorrow." Captain Nemo went back on board his ship. Conseil and I stayed until 5 o'clock surveying the beach. I picked up nothing of interest except for the egg of an auk, remarkable for its size, for which a collector would have paid more than $200. It was cream-colored and covered with streaks and lines which looked like hieroglyphics. I gave it to Conseil, and this worthy, sure-footed boy carried it as if it were a precious Chinese vase, brought it back to the Nautilus. There I deposited this rare egg inside one of the showcases of the museum. That night I dined off an excellent piece of seal liver, which to me tasted rather like pork. When I went to bed, but not before, then I went to bed, but not before praying like a Hindu for the sun to appear. On the next day, March 21st, I was up on the platform at 5 in the morning. I found Captain Nemo already there. "The weather's clearing up a bit," he said. "There's some hope. After breakfast, we'll go ashore and pick out an observation post." Once this had been decided, I went to find Ned Land. I would have wanted to take him with me, but the stubborn Canadian refused, and I could see that day by day he was becoming more taciturn and angry. In this particular circumstance, however, I did not mind his stubbornness. There were really too many seals on shore, and it was best not to expose a man with his hunting instincts to such temptation. After breakfast, I went ashore. The Nautilus had moved several miles further on during the night. It was in open water more than 2 miles from the coast, above which rose a sharp peak about 1,500 feet high. Also in the dinghy were Captain Nemo, 2 members of the crew and the instruments, a chronometer, a telescope, and a barometer. During the crossing, I saw many whales belonging to the 3 species peculiar to the southern waters: the right whale, which has no dorsal fin, the humpback whale, with its wrinkled belly and huge whitish fins, and the finback whale, which is yellowish-brown in color and is the liveliest of all whales. One can hear this animal a long way off when it sends up its spout of air and vapor, resembling a column of swirling smoke. Herds of these various mammals were playing about in the calm water, which I realize now served them as a place of refuge from the hunters tracking them. I also noticed long white rows of salpas, a kind of shellfish which lives in colonies, and enormous jellyfish rocking back and forth in the backwash of the waves. At 9 o'clock we reached shore. The sky was clearing and the clouds scurrying off to the south. Mist was rising from the cold surface of the water. Captain Nemo headed for the peak, where undoubtedly he wanted to make his observation post. It was a difficult climb over sharp lava rocks and pumice stone, through air often filled with the sulphurous gases escaping from volcanic smoke holes. Even though the captain was unaccustomed to walking on dry land, he climbed the steepest slopes with a suppleness and agility which a hunter of mountain goats would have envied, and I had difficulty keeping up with him. It took us 2 hours to reach the summit of this peak, composed partly of porphyry and partly of basalt. From there, we could see a vast expanse of sea stretching out toward the northern horizon. At our feet, there were shining white fields, and overhead, a pale azure sky clear of clouds. To the north, the sun's disk looked like a ball of fire ready to cut off at the corner of the horizon. The whales swimming in the sea sent up hundreds of magnificent fan-shaped jets of water. In the distance, the Nautilus looked like yet another whale, merely sleeping. Behind us, to the south and east, a vast expanse of land, chaotically heaped with rocks and ice, stretched out as far as we could see. Upon arriving at the summit, Captain Nemo carefully calculated its altitude by means of his barometer, for this factor had to be taken into account when determining our position. At 11:45, the sun, a golden disk we could then only see by refraction, since its last rays over this region never before visited by men. Captain Nemo, armed with a special telescope to correct the refraction, observed the sun as it disappeared little by little below the horizon, traveling in a long, curving path. I was holding the chronometer. My heart was pounding. If the disappearance of the sun's half disk coincided with noon on the chronometer, we would then be at the South Pole itself. Noon, I cried. The South Pole, replied Captain Nemo in a solemn tone of voice, passing me the telescope, through which I could see the sun cut into two equal portions by the horizon. I watched its last rays crowning the peak and the shadows of slowly climbing up the slopes. Then Captain Nemo put a hand on my shoulder and said, "In 1600, the Dutchman Gertic, carried off his course by currents and storms, reached 64 degrees south latitude and discovered the South Shetland Islands. On January 17, 1773, the famous Cook, following the 38th meridian, reached a latitude of 67 degrees 30 minutes, and on January 30th, 1774, following the 109th meridian, he reached a latitude of 71 degrees 15 minutes. In 1819, the Russian Bellinghausen got to the 69th parallel, and in 1821 to the 66th at 111 degrees west longitude. In 1820, the Englishman Brunsfield was stopped at the 65th parallel. That same year, the American Morel, whose accounts are doubtful, went along the 42nd meridian and discovered open sea at 70 degrees 14 minutes south latitude. In 1825, the Englishman Powell could get no further than the 62nd parallel, but that same year an Englishman named Weddell, who was a mere seal fisherman, got as far as 72 degrees 14 minutes south latitude along the 35th meridian, and as far as 74 degrees 15 minutes on the 36th. In 1829, the Englishman Forster, captain of the Chanticleer, took possession of the Antarctic continent at 63 degrees 26 minutes south latitude and 66 degrees 26 minutes west longitude. On February 1st, 1831, the Englishman Biscoe discovered Enderby Land at a latitude of 68 degrees 50 minutes. On February 5th, 1832, Adelaide Land at 67 degrees south latitude, and on February 21st of that same year, Graham Land at 64 degrees 45 minutes south latitude, and in 1838, the Frenchman Dumont d'Urville was stopped by the Great Ice Barrier at 62 degrees 57 minutes south latitude, but managed to discover Louis-Philippe Land. 2 years later, in a new expedition to the south, he discovered Adélie Land at 66 degrees 30 minutes on January 21st. And a week later, Clary Coast at 64 degrees 40 minutes south latitude. In 1838, the Englishman Wilkes went along the 100th meridian as far as the 69th parallel. In 1839, the Englishman Bellany discovered Sabrina Land on the edge of the Antarctic Circle. Then, on January 12, 1842, the Englishman James Ross, commanding the Erebus and the Terror, discovered Victoria Land at 76 degrees 56 minutes south latitude and 171 degrees 7 minutes east longitude. On the 23rd of the same month, he reached the 74th parallel, the farthest point attained till then. On the 27th, he reached 76 degrees 8 minutes. On the 28th, 77 degrees 32 minutes. And on February 2nd, 78 degrees 4 minutes. Later in 1842, he returned, but could get no further than the 71st parallel. And then on March 21st, 1868, I, Captain Nemo, reached the South Pole at a latitude of 90 degrees and took possession of this portion of the globe, equal in area to a sixth of all known continents. In the name of whom, Captain? My own! With this, Captain Nemo unfurled a black banner bearing a gold letter N. He then turned toward the sun, whose last rays were flickering over the horizon, and said, "Farewell, sun, leave us, O radiant orb. Go to thy rest beneath the sea, and let 6 months of night spread its shadows over my new domain." And that is the end of chapter 38. So there we go. Apparently, the history books are wrong. It was Captain Nemo who discovered the South Pole. That concludes our reading for today. I'm so glad you could join me for this little session here. Please join us again on Wednesday at 4 p.m., where we will read the next 2 chapters of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. We'll see you again. Bye.